Hello, greetings, and good day to everybody. I am Professor Jun Cajigal, and for today's online lecture on the life sciences, we will take a look at our own circulatory system. Now, our circulatory system performs the following functions. Number one, our circulatory system is involved in the transport of nutrients and materials throughout the body. And our circulatory system plays a very important role in the maintenance of our immunity. Now, when we say immunity, this refers to the defense of the body against disease organisms. So those are the functions of our circulatory system. Our circulatory system again plays a very important role in the transport of nutrients and materials throughout the body, and our circulatory system helps in the maintenance of our immunity. Now, when we say immunity here in relation to the circulatory system, this refers to the defense of the body against disease-causing organisms. So in our study of the circulatory system, we will consider the following. So we will study the pumping organ, which is the heart. Then we will tackle the network of blood vessels that makes up the circulatory system and the fluid medium, which is the blood. So those are the components of the circulatory system. We have the pumping organ, the heart, the network of blood vessels, and the fluid medium, which is the blood. So at this point, let's now zoom in on the pumping organ, which is the heart. Now the heart is approximately about the size of your fist. And in terms of location, the heart is located superior surface of the diaphragm. So that means that the heart is located above the diaphragm. Then the heart is actually located at the middle of the chest, but it is oriented to the left. That's why I mentioned here left of the midline. Then the heart is also anterior to the vertebral column. It is in front of the vertebral column and posterior to the sternum or the breastbone. So that's the location of the human heart. So here is an illustration to help you visualize the location of the human heart. So again, the human heart is approximately the size of your fist. The human heart is located at the middle of the chest but slightly pointing to the left. The heart is located anterior to the vertebral column, meaning it is in front of the vertebral column, and posterior to the sternum or breastbone, meaning that the heart is at the back of the sternum. Actually, the sternum protects the heart. And the human heart is superior to the diaphragm, meaning that the heart is located above the diaphragm. Alright, so here are some facts about the heart. Now, in terms of the beating of the heart, the average adult heart beats at about 72 times a minute. That is 100,000 times in a day, 3,600,000 times in a year, and about 1 billion times during your lifetime. So isn't that fascinating indeed about the human heart? So at this point, let us now zoom in on the anatomy and physiology of the human heart. Now, the human heart is covered by a membrane called the pericardium. Now, the pericardium performs the following functions. Number one, the pericardium protects and anchors the heart. Number two, the pericardium prevents overfilling of the heart with blood. And number three, the pericardium allows for the heart to work in a relatively friction-free environment. So let's take a look now at the anatomy of the pericardium. So again, the pericardium is the membrane that covers the heart, And the pericardium is a double-walled sac composed of the following layers. So we have a superficial fibrous pericardium and a deep two-layer serous pericardium. Now, these two layers of the serous pericardium includes the following. We have the parietal layer that lines the internal surface of the fibrous pericardium, and the visceral layer or the epicardium that lines the surface of the heart. Later, I'll show you an illustration so that we can locate the superficial fibrous pericardium and the serous pericardium with the parietal layer and the epicardium. And the parietal layer and the epicardium, they are separated by a fluid-filled pericardial cavity. So here is an illustration showing the different layers of the pericardium. Now, the pericardium is composed of a fibrous pericardium, and we have the serous pericardium. Now, the serous pericardium is composed of the parietal layer, and we have the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. Now, the visceral layer, as you could see in our illustration, covers the surface of the heart. And the parietal layer and the visceral layer, they are separated by this fluid-filled cavity called the pericardial cavity. Alright, so those are the different layers of the pericardium. So it is very obvious that the fluid-filled pericardial cavity prevents or minimizes the friction between the beating heart and the surrounding tissue. Now, at this point, let's take a look at the heart wall itself. Now, the heart wall is composed of the following layers. So we have the epicardium, which we mentioned earlier. That's the visceral layer of the serous pericardium that covers the surface of the heart. Then we have the myocardium, which is actually the cardiac muscle layer forming the bulk of the heart. The myocardium is actually the cardiac muscle itself. Then we have the fibrous skeleton of the heart, which crisscrossing interlacing layer of connective tissue. And lastly, we have the endocardium, which is the endothelial layer of the inner myocardial surface. So again, let's take a look at the layers that makes up the heart wall. So the heart wall is composed of the visceral layer of the serous pericardium or the epicardium that covers the heart. Then beneath that is the myocardium or the cardiac muscle itself. Then beneath the myocardium is the endocardium. Then beneath the endocardium would be the heart chamber itself. So those are the layers that makes up the heart wall. Now at this point, let us now study the different chambers of the human heart. Now, the human heart is actually a four-chambered muscular organ that again performs and acts like a pump. Now, the human heart is divided into a left section and a right section. Now, the left and the right sections of the human heart, they are divided by a muscular wall called the septum. Now, each section, left and right, is divided into an upper chamber called the atrium and a lower chamber called a ventricle. So each half, left and right, has two chambers. We have the upper chamber or atrium or auricle and a lower chamber called a ventricle. Now, the atrium and the ventricle, they are separated by a valve known as the atrioventricular valve. Now, the function of the atrium or the auricle is to receive blood while the ventricles, they pump blood out of the heart. So those are the different chambers of the human heart. Now again, the human heart is divided into a left section and a right section. The left section and the right section is separated by a muscular wall called the septum. And each section has two chambers. We have an upper chamber or the auricle or atrium, and we have the lower chamber or the ventricle. Now, because of this, we can now identify the different chambers of the heart. So we have a right atrium or right auricle and a right ventricle. Then on the left section, we have the left atrium and the left ventricle. Now, you will notice here that the blood is color-coded. So we have blue and red. Now, the blue blood represents blood that is rich in carbon dioxide. So we call that deoxygenated blood. Now, the red blood represents blood rich in oxygen. So we call that oxygenated blood. And if you will take a look at this animation, the blood rich in carbon dioxide or deoxygenated blood represented by the blue fluid is on the right side of the heart. And the blood rich in oxygen or oxygenated blood flows through the left side of the heart represented by the red fluid. Alright, and the thickness of the cardiac muscle or the myocardium will depend on the function of the chamber. So if you will notice here, the atrium only receives blood as compared to the ventricles. The ventricles, they pump blood away from the heart. That's why the atrium wall is thinner compared to the ventricles. Alright, so the thickness again of the myocardium will depend according to the function of the chamber. And as I mentioned earlier, the atrium, these are thin-walled because they only receive blood. Whereas the ventricles, they are much thicker. The myocardium is much thicker and stronger because they need to pump blood away from the heart. Now, the right ventricle supplies blood to the lungs, and the left ventricle supplies blood to the systemic circulation. And this is the reason why the left ventricular wall or the myocardium of the left ventricle is much thicker as compared to the right ventricle, as you could see here in this illustration. So the myocardium or the ventricular wall of the left ventricle is thicker because the left ventricle must pump blood through the systemic circulation, whereas the ventricular wall or the myocardium of the right ventricle is thinner compared to the left because the right ventricle only pumps blood to the lungs. Alright, so that is with regards to the thickness of the myocardium. Now, I would like to point out that the myocardium of the left ventricle is much thicker than that of the right ventricle, simply because the left ventricle must be able to pump blood throughout the entire systemic circuit, whereas the right ventricle simply pumps blood to the lungs. Alright, so again, the thickness of the myocardium will depend on the function of the chamber. Now, let us proceed with the identification of the different valves that makes up the heart. Now, the right atrium is separated from the right ventricle by the tricuspid valve, and the left atrium is separated from the left ventricle by the bicuspid or mitral valve. So both tricuspid and mitral valves or bicuspid valve, they are the so-called AV valves or atrioventricular valves. And the right ventricle is separated from the pulmonary artery by the so-called pulmonic valve, and the left ventricle is separated from the aorta by the so-called aortic valve. Now, both the pulmonic and the aortic valves, they are the so-called semilunar valves. Alright, and as I have mentioned earlier, the right side of the heart accommodates blood rich in carbon dioxide or deoxygenated blood, while the left side of the heart accommodates oxygenated blood or blood rich in oxygen. Alright, now at this point, let us now study how the blood flows inside the heart. So we start with the right atrium. Now from the right atrium, the blood flows through the tricuspid valve. Then it enters the right ventricle, then to the pulmonic valve, then onto the pulmonary arteries leading to the lungs. Then from the lungs, the blood flows to the pulmonic vein, then left atrium, then through the mitral valve, left ventricle, aortic valves, and we have the aorta. Alright, so that's how blood flows inside the heart. Alright, so let's trace again the flow of blood using this animated illustration. So here, the blood now fills the left atrium. Alright, then the mitral valve opens, then the blood, rich in oxygen from the lungs, enters the left ventricle, then the left ventricle contracts, alright, and the aortic valve opens, then the blood enters the aorta, and from the aorta, the blood rich in oxygen is delivered to the body tissues. Then the blood coming from the body tissues goes back to the heart via the vena cava. Then the blood enters the right atrium. Alright, the blood now enters the right atrium. Then the tricuspid valve opens. Then the blood enters the right ventricle. So the blood gushes now into the right ventricle. The right ventricle contracts. Then the pulmonic valve opens. Then the blood goes through the pulmonary artery leading to the lungs. Alright, inside the lungs, carbon dioxide is released and is replenished with oxygen. So the blood now becomes oxygenated, then it returns to the left side of the heart. The blood now goes to the pulmonary vein, and the blood now rich in oxygen enters the left atrium. So the blood fills the left atrium, then the left atrium contracts, the blood now enters the left ventricle. So the mitral or the bicuspid valve opens, allowing the blood to enter the left ventricle. Alright, the left ventricle contracts, the blood passes through the aortic valve, then the blood now enters the aorta, wherein oxygen and nutrients are delivered to all the body tissues. So that's how blood flows inside the heart. Alright, so at this point, let us now again trace the flow of blood through the heart and lungs. So we start with the right atrium. Now the right atrium receives deoxygenated blood or blood rich in carbon dioxide from the inferior and superior vena cava. Then from the right atrium, the deoxygenated blood passes through the tricuspid valve. So the tricuspid valve opens, the blood then enters the right ventricle. The right ventricle contracts, forcing the blood through the pulmonary semilunar valves. Then from there, the blood enters the pulmonary arteries leading to the lungs. Now inside the lungs, the carbon dioxide is released and the blood is replenished with oxygen. So the blood now becomes oxygenated. Then from the lungs, the oxygenated blood enters the pulmonary veins going back to the heart. Then the blood rich in oxygen enters the left atrium. Then from the left atrium, the blood enters the bicuspid valve. So the bicuspid valve opens, then the blood enters the left ventricle. The left ventricle contracts, forcing the blood through the aortic semilunar valve and onto the aorta. Then the aorta will deliver the oxygenated blood through the entire systemic circulation. So that's the pathway of blood through the heart and lungs. Now, with this discussion of the pathway of blood through the heart and lungs, we can say that there are two general circulations that make up our circulatory system. So we have what we call the pulmonary circuit or pulmonary circulation, and we have the systemic circuit or systemic circulation. Now let's zoom in on the pulmonary circulation of the blood. So we begin at the right atrium. The right atrium receives the oxygenated blood from the body tissues via the superior and inferior vena cava. So from the right atrium, the blood enters the right ventricle via the tricuspid valve. So the tricuspid valve opens, allowing the deoxygenated blood to enter the right ventricle. The right ventricle contracts, forcing the blood through the pulmonic valve. The pulmonic valve opens. Then the blood enters the pulmonary artery that delivers the deoxygenated blood to the lungs. Then inside the lungs, carbon dioxide is released and the blood is replenished with oxygen. So the blood now becomes oxygenated inside the lungs. Then this oxygenated blood passes through the pulmonary vein back to the heart, and eventually the blood rich in oxygen enters the left atrium. So this completes the pulmonary circuit or pulmonary circulation. Then from the left atrium, the oxygenated blood enters the left ventricle via the mitral valve. The mitral valve opens, allowing the blood to flow to the left ventricle. The left ventricle contracts, forcing the blood through the aortic valve and onto the aorta. Now the aorta will now deliver the blood rich in oxygen to the entire systemic circulation or the body tissues. The cells will use the oxygen and carbon dioxide is released as a result of metabolism. This deoxygenated blood again goes to the veins back to the heart via the inferior and superior vena cava. So that completes the so-called systemic circulation. Now we have to mention this special type of circulation other than the pulmonary and the systemic circulation. And I am referring here to the so-called coronary circuit or coronary circulation. Now the coronary circulation is a special type of circulation wherein the heart receives its own supply of blood from the coronary arteries. There are two major coronary arteries that branch off from the aorta near the point where the aorta and the left ventricle meet. So I am referring here to the left coronary artery and the right coronary artery. Now these two arteries and their branches supply all the parts of the heart muscle with blood. So that's the function of the coronary circulation. The coronary circulation sees to it that the heart is supplied with blood. Alright, so here is an illustration of the coronary circulation showing the major arteries that makes up the coronary circuit. So again, you have the left coronary artery and the right coronary artery. Then from there, the branches will ensure that the heart muscle is supplied with blood. Alright, so before we continue, let's watch this fascinating video about the heart, its anatomy, and the other aspect of our remarkable pumping organ. Alright, so let's watch this.
The heart is an organ made up of several tough layers of muscle. The pericardium is the thin layer that covers the exterior, while the endocardium lines the inside walls. The heart is divided into 4 chambers, 2 upper and 2 lower. The upper chambers, known as the atrium, receive blood coming into the heart. The lower chambers are the ventricles that pump blood out. Between each chamber are valves that open and close and help keep the blood moving. They are the tricuspid, mitral, pulmonary, and aortic valves. A pumping cycle starts when oxygen-depleted blood returns to the heart after circulating throughout the body. The blood enters through the right atrium before flowing to the right ventricle. It's then pumped to the lungs via the pulmonary arteries. There, blood is rejuvenated by air that's breathed in. The oxygen-rich blood returns to the heart through the left atrium, where it goes to the left ventricle. Then, by way of the aorta artery, the fresh blood is pumped throughout the body before the process repeats itself. That process happens with every heartbeat, and it's relentless. The heart beats 100,000 times a day, 40 million times a year, and up to 3 billion times over an average lifespan. But there are conditions that can disrupt a heartbeat and that normality. They can range from myocardial infarction or a heart attack to heart disease and hypertension. In contrast, exercise and emotional excitement can also have an impact on a person's heartbeat. The various blood vessels that comprise the circulatory system are a network of veins, arteries, and capillaries that span over 60,000 miles throughout the body, and the heart is the pump at the center of it.
Alright, so isn't that fascinating about the human heart? Now, at this point, let us now study the physiology of the cardiac muscle contraction. Now, you have to take note that in order for the heart to contract, there must be a stimulation. So the heart muscle is stimulated by nerves and the contraction is self-excitable, meaning it's automatic. And the heart muscle contracts as a unit and has a long absolute refractory period to about 250 milliseconds. And the cardiac muscle contraction is actually similar to skeletal muscle contraction. So again, before the heart muscle contracts, there must be stimulation by the nerves. Now, the electrical impulse needed to stimulate the heart muscle or the cardiac muscle to contract is generated by the following structures. So first, we have what we call the sinoatrial node or the SA node. Now, the sinoatrial node is a specialized myocardial structure that initiates the electrical impulses to stimulate the heart muscle to contract. The sinoatrial node can be considered as the heart's natural pacemaker, sends out electrical impulses to the upper chambers of the heart or the atria. This will allow the atria to contract. Now, there is another structure in the heart that is essential in the stimulation of the cardiac muscle to contract, and that is the so-called atrioventricular node or AV node or AVN. Now, the inherent physiological function of the atrioventricular node or the AVN is to delay the cardiac impulse propagation between the atria and the ventricles. And also, the atrioventricular node functions as a backup pacemaker in the setting of the SA node dysfunction or advanced atrioventricular or AV block. Now, let's take a look at this illustration of the human heart showing the sinoatrial node and the atrioventricular node. Alright, so the sinoatrial node, that's the structure labeled number 1. The sinoatrial node is the so-called the heart's natural pacemaker. The sinoatrial node generates the electrical impulses necessary for the heart muscle to be stimulated to contract. So the atria first receives the electrical signals or impulses, then this will allow the atria to contract. Then the electrical impulses are then received by the atrioventricular node labeled number 2. Then the atrioventricular node will then transmit the signals to the ventricles. But before that transmission, there is a delay for about 0.1 seconds. Then eventually, the electrical impulses after that delay will travel to the atrioventricular bundle that's labeled number 3, or the so-called bundle of His. The bundle of His, they are located in the septum, and at the apex of the heart, the bundle of His splits into two. One goes to the left side of the heart, the other goes to the right. And eventually, those bundle of His, after splitting, branches off into the so-called Purkinje fibers labeled number 5. The signals are then received by the ventricles. Then the ventricles eventually, they get stimulated, and eventually the ventricles contract. Alright, so before we continue, I want to point out the following. So again, the AV node or the atrioventricular node controls the passage of the heart's electrical signals from the atria to the ventricles. Then after an electrical impulse is generated by the sinoatrial node, the signals spreads across both atria, causing the chambers to contract. Then the AV node then receives or gathers the electrical impulses. Then as I mentioned earlier, there is a delay. Now after that brief delay, the impulses again would pass through the bundle of His and to the ventricles. The ventricles are then stimulated to contract. Now this delay in the transmission of the electrical signals through the AV node or the atrioventricular node is crucial or vital to a normal heartbeat and the efficient functioning of the heart. Now to continue, as we mentioned, the sinoatrial node generates the electrical signals, and then the signals are received by the AV node. Now the AV node will eventually transmit the signals to the so-called atrioventricular bundle or the bundle of His. The atrioventricular bundle or the bundle of His eventually splits into two pathways in the interventricular septum. The bundle branches carry the impulses towards the apex of the heart. Then from there, the bundle of His would split into two and forming the so-called Purkinje fibers. The Purkinje fibers carries now the electrical impulses to the ventricular walls, and eventually the ventricles would be stimulated to contract. So that's it. That's the physiology of the cardiac muscle contraction. So again, before we move on, let's take a look at this animated diagram showing how the electrical signals are generated and transmitted. So as we mentioned, the sinoatrial node generates the electrical impulses. The electrical impulses are then received by the atria, allowing the atria to be stimulated to contract. Then the signals are then gathered by the AV node or the atrioventricular node. But before the AV node could transmit the signals to the ventricles, there is a delay of about 0.1 seconds. Then eventually after the delay, the AV node transmits the electrical signals through the bundle of His located in the septum of the heart. Then from the apex of the heart, the bundle of His splits into two, forming the so-called Purkinje fibers. Then the Purkinje fibers then transmits the signals to the ventricular muscular wall, allowing it to be stimulated, and this will trigger the ventricles to contract. Alright, so that's basically the physiology of the cardiac muscle contraction. Alright, so at this point, let's watch this fantastic video about the human heart again and the physiology of the cardiac muscle contraction. Alright, so let's watch this.
The right side of the heart receives venous blood from the body through the superior and inferior vena cava, which enter the right atrium. Blood flows through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Blood leaves the right ventricle through the pulmonary valve into the main pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery divides into right and left pulmonary arteries to transport deoxygenated blood from the right side of the heart to the right and left lungs. The pulmonary arteries branch further into the pulmonary capillary bed where oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange occurs. The four pulmonary veins, 2 from the right lung and 2 from the left lung, carry oxygenated blood from the lungs to the left side of the heart. The oxygenated blood flows from the left atrium through the mitral valve and into the left ventricle and out through the aortic valve and into the aorta and to the body.
Cardiac valves.
This picture shows the individual heart valves. The heart valve openings are protected by flaps of tissue called leaflets or cusps that are attached to the papillary muscles by the chordae tendineae. The papillary muscles are extensions of the heart muscle that pull the cusps together and downward at the onset of ventricular contraction. As the pressure increases in the ventricles, the valves close and the papillary muscles prevent the valves from opening.
Coronary arteries.
The branch of the circulation that supplies oxygen and other nutrients to the cells of the heart is called the coronary circulation. The major coronary arteries are the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery. The left coronary artery originates from a single opening behind the left cusp of the aortic valve and divides into the left anterior descending artery and the circumflex artery. The right coronary artery originates from an opening behind the right cusp of the aortic valve and divides into the three major branches: the conus, the right marginal branch, and the posterior descending branch. After flowing through an extensive network of capillaries, blood from the coronary arteries drain into the cardiac veins. The veins follow into the great cardiac vein and coronary sinus. Blood empties from the coronary sinus into the right atrium. Electrical impulses originate in the sinoatrial node, located at the junction of the right atrium and superior vena cava. Each electrical impulse generated from the SA node travels through the right and left atrium, causing the atria to contract. The impulse then travels to the atrioventricular node, AV node, then to the bundle of His, and finally through the right and left bundle branches of the ventricles, causing the ventricles to contract. The P wave of an electrocardiogram represents atrial contraction. The PR interval is a measure of time from the onset of atrial contraction to the onset of ventricular contraction. The QRS complex represents the complete depolarization of the ventricles. The ST segment represents the complete repolarization of the ventricles. Elevation or depression of this segment may indicate heart muscle ischemia. The QT interval represents the complete depolarization and repolarization of the ventricles. A prolonged QT interval is a risk factor for ventricular arrhythmias and sudden death. Pressures on the left side of the heart are usually 3 times greater than the right side of the heart. A normal right atrial pressure is usually around 3 with a range of 2 to 8. And left atrial pressure is usually 8 with a range of 6 to 12 millimeters of mercury.
Now, I hope you have learned a lot from that video, especially the interpretation of the electrocardiogram readings. Alright, so this ends part 1 of our online lecture of the human circulatory system. In the second video, part 2 of the circulatory system, we will be focusing on the blood vessels, arteries, and veins, and the fluid medium, which is the blood. So again, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, The Science Guy, Professor Jun Cajigal, and please like and share this video so that we could inspire young minds to love the sciences, especially the life sciences. Alright, so please watch that second video about the blood vessels and the blood. This is Professor Jun Cajigal saying live long and prosper. Alright, so watch out for that second video. So long for now.